The morning they told Eleanor Marsh she had 30 days to leave the only home her children had ever known, she was standing in the kitchen trying to make oatmeal stretch into 2 bowls from what should have been one. She had gotten good at that kind of arithmetic in the 14 months since Daniel died. The quiet, invisible math of survival that nobody teaches you and everybody eventually learns. She turned off the burner. She set the letter from the bank on the counter beside the pot. She looked out the window at the yard where her daughter Lily, who was 9 years old, was sitting in the frost-hardened grass talking to a sparrow that had landed 2 feet away from her, as if it understood the assignment. Lucas, who was 15, was already at the end of the driveway waiting for the school bus, his shoulders hunched inside a jacket that had belonged to his father and still smelled like him if you buried your face in the collar and breathed in hard enough. Eleanor watched her children for a long moment without moving. The letter said what letters from banks said when they had run out of patience and you had run out of options. It used words like delinquency and foreclosure and proceedings, words that meant the same thing no matter how you dressed them. It meant that by the 22nd of the following month, the house at 4 Birchwood Lane in Calder County, Virginia, would no longer belong to the Marsh family. It would belong to the institution that had extended good faith to Daniel Marsh in the spring of a year that now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime entirely. Daniel had taken out the second mortgage without telling her. She had found that out 3 weeks after the funeral, when a man in a gray suit came to the door with documents that needed signatures and a sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. The money had gone into Daniel's contracting business, which had gone into a lawsuit over a project in Roanoke that had gone bad, which had gone into legal fees, which had gone into nothing. That was the architecture of their collapse, each floor resting on the one below it, all the way down to the foundation, which turned out to have been built on good intentions and very little else. Eleanor poured the oatmeal into 2 bowls anyway. She called Lily inside. She did not call Lucas because he was already at the bus stop and because there was nothing to say over the sound of an engine pulling up that wouldn't feel wrong in his father's jacket. She sat across from her daughter, and they ate together while the morning light came through the curtains Daniel had installed crookedly and never gotten around to fixing, and she thought about what she was going to do. She had $47 in her checking account. She had a part-time position answering phones at Dr. Whitfield's veterinary clinic 3 days a week, which paid enough to cover groceries with some planning and not enough to cover anything else. She had a mother in Delaware who had already loaned her everything she could without creating her own crisis. She had a sister in Charlottesville who had offered her couch, which Eleanor had declined because her sister's apartment had 1 bedroom and a dog with anxiety issues, and because accepting that offer felt like the kind of surrender that you couldn't come back from. She had her children. She had Daniel's memory, which was complicated now in ways it hadn't been when he was alive. She had a letter giving her 30 days. She had 2 bowls of oatmeal that weren't quite enough. What she did not have, and had not had since she was 23 years old and working double shifts at a hospital on the south side of Richmond, was the luxury of waiting for someone to solve things for her. So she ate her oatmeal, and she thought. It was Miriam Oakes who first mentioned the auction. Miriam worked the front desk at Whitfield's on the days Eleanor didn't, and she had the particular gift of knowing everything about everybody in Calder County before they knew it about themselves. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things, sideways, while doing something else entirely, as if the information were incidental rather than precisely aimed. They were restocking the supply cabinet in the back hallway when Miriam said, without looking up from a box of surgical tape, that the county was auctioning off the old MacAllister property on the far edge of Route 9. The auction was that Saturday. She said the MacAllister shed in particular was expected to go for almost nothing because the rest of the property had already been parceled and sold, and the shed was what was left, sitting on its little quarter-acre with its caved-in roof, and its vines, and its general air of things that have given up. Eleanor asked what a MacAllister was. Miriam said the MacAllisters had been the Orchard family out on Route 9 for most of the last century. Old Harlan MacAllister had run the apple operation from the 40s through the late 80s, when he died without heirs and the county took the land for back taxes. Most of it had been sold off in pieces over the years, absorbed into larger farms or let go to developers who built 3 subdivisions and a storage facility where the apple trees used to be. The shed was the last fragment. A quarter-acre parcel with a structure on it that the county had classified as a storage building, though Miriam used air quotes around the word storage in a way that suggested she had seen it. Eleanor asked if she had seen it. Miriam said she had driven past it once on the way to her sister-in-law's, and that the word crumbling was doing a lot of charitable work when applied to a structure whose roof had partially collapsed inward sometime in the previous decade. She said the Historical Society had looked at it and decided it wasn't historical enough to be worth preserving. She said the adjacent property owners had looked at it and decided it wasn't close enough to their fences to be their problem. She said the county just wanted it off the books. Eleanor stood in the supply hallway with a box of surgical tape in her arms and thought about a building nobody wanted. She drove out to Route 9 that Thursday afternoon, after her shift and before she needed to pick up Lily from school. She left the car at the gravel turnout near the old fence post that still had a MacAllister Orchard sign on it, faded to near illegibility, but hanging on by the kind of stubbornness that outlasts even the things it was meant to announce. She walked the 30 yards through knee-high grass and dried wildflowers to the shed. Miriam had not been wrong about the condition. The roof had given way on the eastern third, the collapse happening in stages over years by the look of it, each winter taking a little more and leaving debris that seasons of rain had pressed down into the floor. Siding boards had peeled away from the frame on the north face. Virginia creeper had colonized everything it could reach, which was most of the exterior, and had sent exploratory tendrils through the open places in the wall. The door was a barn-style sliding door on a metal track, and the track had warped enough that the door hung at an angle without quite falling. Eleanor stood in front of it for a while. The afternoon light was thin and golden the way it gets in October in the Virginia foothills, and it came through the standing portion of the roof and the gaps in the siding in long parallel lines that lit up the dust inside, like something deliberate. She put her hand against the surviving door. The wood was old, but not rotten. She pushed, and the door moved on its warped track with protest, but without drama. She stepped inside. The smell was apples and thyme. Not unpleasant. The kind of smell that lives inside old barns and root cellars and places where living things were processed and stored and tended over many years, where the work of seasons soaks into the wood until it becomes part of the material itself. The floor was plank construction, wide boards of what looked like chestnut, the kind of lumber that hadn't been widely available since a blight took most of the American chestnut population in the early 20th century. Old then. Older than the shed's most recent use would suggest. She noticed two things in the minute she spent standing in the available light before the sun shifted. The first was that the floor, despite the collapsed roof above, was dry. Not merely dry in the way of places that haven't seen rain recently. Genuinely dry in the way of places that have never been particularly accessible to moisture, the way of places that have something beneath them other than earth. The second was a seam in the far end of the floor that ran at right angles to the plank direction. Not a crack from settling. A seam. The kind you find around a door. She went down on one knee and looked more closely, but the light had shifted and she couldn't see the detail clearly. She pressed her palm to the planks around the seam. They felt solid. No give. No flex. But the seam was there, running in a clean rectangle approximately 4 feet by 3, with what appeared to be a recessed iron ring at the near edge, flush with the wood. She stood up. She looked at the collapsed portion of the roof, the standing portion, the stripped siding, the creeper vines that had made the whole structure their personal infrastructure project. She thought about 30 days. She thought about $47. She thought about Lily talking to a sparrow in frost-hardened grass and Lucas wearing his father's jacket at the end of the driveway. She went home and called the county auction office to confirm the Saturday time. The auction was held in the parking lot of the county administration building on a Saturday morning that couldn't make up its mind about weather. The sky moved between overcast and thin sunshine in intervals, throwing the gathered crowd into alternating shadow and pale light that made everyone look slightly different than they actually were. There were perhaps 40 people present for the various lots being offered that day. Most of them were there for the remnant parcels from 2 other estates being settled, agricultural land with clearer value and better road access than the MacAllister shed parcel. Eleanor recognized a few faces from Calder County circles. Bud Hennessy, who ran the farm supply, and his brother Ray. Gloria Tatum from the real estate office on Main Street. A man she didn't know in a quilted vest who had the look of someone who bought things at auctions professionally. She did not see anyone she would have described as competition for the MacAllister shed specifically. The county auctioneer was a man named Gerald Potts who had been doing this job for 22 years, and had developed a delivery that managed to sound both formal and conversational at once, the tone of someone who has said the same kinds of things so many times that he no longer thinks consciously about the words. He ran through the earlier lots efficiently. The agricultural parcels went for amounts that reflected genuine land value. The quilted vest man acquired 2 items with the calm of someone spending other people's money. Then Gerald Potts described the MacAllister orchard shed parcel. He described it accurately. She would give him that. Quarter-acre lot on Route 9. Existing structure in deteriorated condition. Classified as storage building. No utilities connected. No septic. County had been unable to identify any historical designation. Minimum bid $12. There was a sound in the crowd. Not quite laughter. The social noise that groups of people make when something confirms what they already suspected about the world. Eleanor raised her hand. $12. Gerald Potts looked at her for a moment. Nobody bid against her. He gave it the appropriate count. The sound of the gavel was very clean in the cold morning air. What Eleanor remembered most from the next few minutes was not the paperwork or the handshakes or Gerald Potts's professionally neutral expression as he processed the transaction. It was Bud Hennessy turning to his brother Ray and saying, in a voice that was not particularly quiet, that somebody had bought herself a magnificent pile of firewood for $12. And wasn't that something? Gloria Tatum from the real estate office caught Eleanor's eye as she was signing the deed transfer. Gloria's expression mixed pity with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Something like the face people make when they watch someone make a choice they consider irreversible in the wrong direction. You know the property is unimproved, she said. No water access, no power, no septic. Whatever's on that lot, the county makes no representations about habitability. She said it the way people say things they are legally obligated to say, with the inflection of someone discharging a duty rather than offering genuine counsel. Eleanor said she understood. She folded her copy of the deed and put it in her coat pocket. She thanked Gerald Potts. She walked to her car in the parking lot of the county administration building with $47 minus $12 now in her checking account and the deed to a crumbling orchard shed on Route 9. She sat in the car for a moment before starting it. The crowd was dispersing around her, conversations drifting past the windows, fragments about acreage and road frontage and what the county was and wasn't doing about the Route 9 corridor. She heard Bud Hennessy again, though she couldn't see him. Something about women making emotional decisions, and about Daniel Marsh having left his family in a condition that created exactly this kind of desperate logic. She started the car. Lucas took the news the way 15-year-old boys take most news that involves their mother making decisions without consulting them, with a silence that was not quite neutral and an expression that asked questions without committing to asking them. He sat at the kitchen table with his homework in front of him and his father's jacket still on because the house had been cold since. Eleanor started rationing the oil, and he listened to her describe the shed and the auction and the $12. When she finished, he said, "Why?" She had been thinking about how to answer that question since the parking lot. "Because there was something in the floor of that shed," she said, "that I need to go back and look at. Because the wood in that building is old and the floor doesn't feel right and there's a seam that shouldn't be there. Because it was $12 and it's ours, and when everything else is not going to be ours in 30 days, I needed something that was." Lucas looked at her. He had Daniel's eyes, the same shade that shifted between gray and green depending on the light, and in that moment looking at her in the kitchen light, they were very gray and very steady. He said, "Okay." Lily was less complicated about it. Lily had a 9-year-old's relationship with property law, which is to say she did not have one. And so the concept of a shed being theirs was simply exciting rather than fraught. She asked if they could put a door on it. She asked if there was enough room for a garden. She asked about the sparrow situation, whether the environment was suitable. Eleanor told her she would look into all of it. She did not sleep well that Thursday night. She lay in the bed she had shared with Daniel for 11 years and looked at the ceiling he had painted twice. The second time because the first color hadn't been quite what she wanted, and she ran the seam in the floor of the MacAllister shed through her mind again and again. The iron ring, flush with the wood. The rectangle running counter to the plank direction. The dryness of the planks despite the collapsed roof above. She was not given to conclusions without evidence. She had worked enough years in settings that required precision to know the danger of building forward from what you want to find. But the seam was there. She had seen it. And the thing about seams is that they exist because something made them, And things that make seams in the floors of old orchard buildings tend to be the same kind of thing. A space below. A root cellar. A cold storage room. The agricultural technology of people who needed to keep things at stable temperatures before the electrical grid made that easy. She knew what root cellars were. Daniel had found one under his grandmother's house in West Virginia, walled with dry stacked stone and perfectly preserved despite the house above it having been built in 1921. They had gone to look at it on a weekend trip when Lucas was small, all four of them by then, Lily not yet born. Daniel had taken photographs and texted them to his mother, captioned "Your mother-in-law's secret wine cellar," which had made Eleanor laugh in a way she hadn't in a while. She thought about that root cellar in West Virginia, the way the temperature had dropped when Daniel lifted the hatch, the damp mineral smell of earth and stone, the preserved quality of everything inside. She thought about old Harlan MacAllister running his apple operation from the 40s through the 80s, about 40 years of orchard work, about the economic logic of keeping cold storage on your own land versus paying someone else for it. She thought about what you kept in a root cellar for 40 years and whether any of it was still there. She went back to the shed that Saturday afternoon, 3 days after the auction. She brought Lucas, because he had asked to come and because she had decided that there was no version of whatever this was that happened without her children knowing about it. She brought a flashlight, a pry bar from Daniel's toolbox in the garage, and a thermos of coffee. The shed looked different when it belonged to her, or she looked at it differently. The creeper vines were still there, the leaning siding, the caved-in portion of roof. But she noticed now that the standing 2/3 of the roof, the portion that had survived whatever sequence of winters had taken the rest, was actually in better condition than it appeared from the road. The rafters were visible through gaps in the roofing material, and they were sound. Someone had built this structure to last, whatever it looked like now. Lucas said, "This is the $12 shed." He said it not with mockery, but with assessment, the way he evaluated things he wasn't sure about, giving them the reality of words before he decided what he thought. She said yes. He walked around it once before they went in, the way his father used to walk around things, looking at the back and the sides, as if the building might have a different story to tell from another angle. When he came back to the front, he said the foundation was stone, dry stacked, good work, and that the parts of the wall that had lost their siding were actually showing solid framing underneath, not rotted. She asked how he knew about foundation work. He looked at her with an expression that said he had spent 15 years watching his father build things. He said he just knew. Inside, the afternoon light came through the same gaps as before, moving now because the sky was doing different things. Eleanor went directly to the far end of the shed, to the seam she had found. She crouched down and put her hand on the planks, running her fingers along the line where the plank direction changed. Lucas crouched beside her. He took the flashlight and held it at a low angle that threw the seam into sharp relief. It was a door. Absolutely a door, and once you saw it that way you couldn't unsee it. The rectangle was approximately 4 by 3 feet, set into the floor with the grain running at a right angle to the surrounding planks, and the iron ring was recessed in a way that suggested it had been designed to be flush, invisible from above unless you were looking for it. The fit was tight. The hinges, which were on the far side, were completely concealed by the door's edge. She put 2 fingers through the ring and pulled. It didn't move, not from rot or swelling, but from weight. Whatever was below was keeping air from getting under the door, creating a seal that required force rather than technique. She handed Lucas the pry bar. He fitted it into the seam at the side opposite the ring, worked it gently, not forcing but persuading, the way his father had taught him to approach things that didn't want to open. There was a sound like an intake of breath, a release of pressure, and the door came up. The smell was exactly what she had imagined and nothing like it. Old stone, dry earth, cold air that carried the ghost of apples, and something else underneath, something mineral and clean that she had no immediate category for. The temperature difference was immediate and significant. Air that had been sitting at a stable underground temperature for however long it had been sitting there, pressing up against the warmer air of the shed. Lucas held the flashlight over the opening. Below was a staircase of 6 stone steps leading down to a floor. She could see enough to understand the dimensions. The space below was larger than the door suggested. Much larger. He looked at her. She looked at him. They went down. The root cellar ran the full length and width of the shed and then some, extending 6 feet beyond the shed's footprint in both directions, a full 12 by 20 feet of below-grade space with stone walls that rose 7 feet to a ceiling supported by chestnut beams that matched the floor above. The construction was careful and deliberate in a way that spoke to someone who built things with the intention of having them outlast him. Along the walls, wooden shelving had been installed in sections, floor to ceiling on 3 sides. Most of the shelving was empty. The jars and canned goods and stored apples that would have occupied this space in Harlan MacAllister's working years were long gone, taken or consumed or simply decomposed into memory. But the shelving was not the thing that made Eleanor stop moving in the middle of the root cellar floor and reach out to find the wall with her hand. Against the back wall, beneath the lowest shelf where the shelving system was interrupted by a section of stone that protruded slightly from the wall face, were wooden boxes. Not shelved. Stacked. 6 stacks, each approximately 3 boxes high. The boxes themselves roughly the size of the kind of case that wine comes in, though clearly not wine cases. The wood was different. Dense, dark, the kind of tight-grained tropical hardwood that doesn't grow in Virginia and doesn't appear in apple orchards unless someone brought it there specifically. Each box was bound with metal straps. Each strap had a fastening mechanism. Each fastening mechanism was locked. Lucas swung the flashlight from stack to stack, counting. He counted 18 boxes total. Then he swung the light to something she had not yet noticed, set against the wall beside the stacked boxes, leaning with the carelessness of something placed quickly in a hurry. An old leather satchel, cracked at the fold lines, the brass fixtures dulled to near black. The kind of satchel that had been made in the middle of the last century by someone who made things to last. Eleanor went to the satchel first. She picked it up and felt immediate weight, not the weight of emptiness, but the weight of papers, many papers, and something harder at the bottom. She set it on the floor and unclasped it. Inside were papers, exactly as the weight had suggested. Documents, folded letters, a ledger, small, bound in cloth that had once been green, a folded map with creases worn soft from repeated opening, and at the bottom, heavy, wrapped in a cloth that had once been red and was now the general brown of things that have been wrapped a long time, a brass compass with an inscription on the back that she held to the flashlight to read. H. J. M. 1943. Harlan James MacAllister. The dates fit. The compass was his. The satchel was his. She unfolded the ledger. The handwriting was small and precise, the kind of script that older generations were taught as a matter of discipline rather than expression. Each entry was dated, and the dates ran from 1951 through 1981, 30 years of entries in a handwriting that grew incrementally smaller and more cramped over the decades in the way handwriting does when hands develop the tremors that come with age. She did not read every entry in the root cellar with Lucas's flashlight beginning to pick up the amber tinge of a battery not long for the world. She read enough. She read the entry from April 1951 that described the installation of the storage boxes in the root cellar below the orchard shed, mentioning them as the outcome of a business arrangement with a man named Reyes who had come from South America and needed discretion and was willing to pay well for it. She read the entry from November 1963 that described Reyes returning and leaving additional boxes, fewer this time, with instructions that they were not to be moved or opened under any circumstances short of Harlan's own death, at which point Harlan was to use his judgment. She read the entry from March 1979 that was written in a shakier hand and said only that Reyes had died in Bogota and there was no one to contact about the arrangement, and that Harlan had spent 3 days trying to decide what to do and had decided to do nothing, which was the only thing that felt right to him, and that he was leaving this ledger so that whoever came after would understand. She read the final entry, dated October 1981, which said that Harlan was writing this on his 70th birthday and that he had looked at those boxes most days for 30 years and had never opened them and never would, that a man's word given in confidence was his word even if the other man was dead, and that whatever was in those boxes belonged to whoever could legally claim them, but that he was fairly certain from the weight and the sound they made when he had moved them the second time, that whoever claimed them would not be disappointed. Eleanor Marsh sat on the stone floor of a root cellar under a crumbling orchard shed she had bought for $12 with the bank's 30-day notice in her coat pocket and held a dead man's ledger and looked at 18 locked wooden boxes and breathed very carefully in and out until she was sure she was not going to do anything undignified. Lucas was very quiet beside her. He had read over her shoulder for some of it. He understood enough. She said, "We need to tell no one about this until we know what we're looking at." He said, "Okay." She said, "I mean no one, Lucas." He said, "Mom, I understood you the first time." She put the ledger back in the satchel with the other documents and the compass. She latched the satchel and carried it up the stairs. Lucas followed and pulled the root cellar door back down, seated it carefully in its frame, smoothed the iron ring flush with the wood. From above it looked like a variation in the floor plank orientation and nothing more. They drove home through the October afternoon and said nothing for most of it. At the turnoff for Birchwood Lane, Lucas said, "What do you think is in them?" She said she wasn't sure. He said, "Yes, you are." She looked at the road. After a moment, she said, "The weight is wrong for most things. Agricultural equipment, jars, anything that would have come from the orchard business. And tropical hardwood boxes with metal straps and locks don't appear in Virginia apple orchards through any normal commercial transaction." He waited. She said, "I think it might be gold." The word sat between them in the car with a weight of its own. Lucas said, "Okay, so what do we do?" She said she needed to find someone who knew what they were looking at. A professional. Someone who could identify the contents of a locked wooden box without her opening it, or tell her how to open it without damaging whatever was inside, and who could be trusted to keep his mouth shut until she understood what she was dealing with. She did not call anyone that night. She put the satchel under the loose floorboard in the back of her closet, the one she had never gotten around to telling the bank's appraiser about during the refinancing 2 years before Daniel died. She made dinner. She helped Lily with homework. She watched Lucas do his own homework at the kitchen table in his father's jacket and thought about a man named Harlan MacAllister who had kept someone else's secret for 30 years because he gave his word. She thought about what kind of person that made him. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be when this was over. She did not sleep again until nearly 3 in the morning. The next day at Whitfield's veterinary clinic, between answering phones and processing invoices, Eleanor looked up the name Reyes in connection with South America and gold in 1951 in Bogota, casting wide nets through the thin internet connection the clinic's aging router provided. What she found was partial and fragmentary, the way historical records tend to be when the people involved had good reasons not to be found. But she found enough to understand the shape of things. In the aftermath of World War II, a significant quantity of gold, some of it looted from European depositories, some of it the legitimate holdings of South American industrialists seeking to move wealth ahead of political instability, had circulated through informal networks. People who needed to move physical assets across borders without documentation. Trusted intermediaries in unlikely locations. Farm properties in rural Virginia were not, historically, an uncommon choice for this kind of arrangement. They offered isolation, legitimate agricultural cover, and owners with the character of people who kept to themselves and kept their word. She was not building a case yet. She was mapping the terrain of something she didn't fully understand. She was a woman with $47 minus 12 in her checking account and a 30-day notice from a bank and 2 children who needed her to be right about this. She left the clinic at 4 o'clock and drove directly to the Calder County Courthouse, where the records office was still open until 5. She asked for the historical deed records on the MacAllister parcel on Route 9, all of them going back to the original land grant. The clerk, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain who had been working in that office long enough to have personal opinions about the filing system, retrieved a folder without commentary and set it on the counter. Eleanor spent 40 minutes with the folder. She found Harlan MacAllister's original purchase of the land in 1938. She found the deed transfer to the county in 1989 following his death with no heirs. She found every subsequent parceling and sale. She found the lot description for the quarter-acre that included the shed, the same language that had appeared in Saturday's auction documents. And she found, tucked into the back of the folder behind a county tax notice from 1976, a single page in Harlan MacAllister's small, precise handwriting. Not a deed, not a legal document. A letter addressed to whomever it may concern, dated August 1981, notarized by someone named Patricia Elgin, whose notary stamp was still legible despite 40 years and the particular indignity of being filed behind a tax notice. It said that Harlan MacAllister, being of sound mind, wished to state for the record that the root cellar below the orchard storage shed on his property contained items placed there in trust by a man named Augusto Reyes of Bogotá, Colombia, in 1951 and again in 1963, under an agreement of confidence that had been nullified by Reyes's death in 1979. He wished to state that he considered the contents to be without legal claimant in the traditional sense, that he had made inquiries through an attorney in Roanoke who had told him the situation was complicated, that he was leaving the resolution of this to whatever hands found it, and that he hoped those hands belonged to someone who deserved a bit of luck. Eleanor read this paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, told the clerk thank you, and walked out of the courthouse into an October evening that smelled like rain coming and the far edge of wood smoke from somewhere up the road. She sat in her car for 17 minutes. She thought about deserving. She was not a person who had spent much time on the question of what she deserved. The years with Daniel had been good and complicated, and then very complicated, and then over before she had finished processing the complicated part. The years since had been about survival in the practical sense, not the philosophical one. What she deserved had not been a category she applied to herself. But she was sitting in a car in a courthouse parking lot with a 30-day bank notice and a root cellar full of locked boxes and a dead man's letter saying he hoped these things would go to someone who deserved a bit of luck, and she was trying to decide what to do next, and the question of deserving was suddenly very much present. She thought about Lily in the frost-hardened grass talking to a sparrow. She thought about Lucas wearing his father's jacket because he was cold and because the jacket was the closest thing to his father that still existed. She thought about Daniel painting the ceiling twice and getting the curtain rods slightly crooked and never quite getting around to fixing it. She thought about what it would mean to be right about this. Not the money. Not yet. She was not letting herself think about the money in any specific way, but simply the fact of being right. The $12 that everyone in that parking lot had treated as a joke. Bud Hennessy and his brother Ray. Gloria Tatum with her sympathetic expression. Gerald Potts's professionally neutral face as he processed the transaction. She thought about the things people say about women making emotional decisions, said in voices that are not quite quiet enough. She started the car. The attorney she found was named James Whitaker, and he came recommended by the clerk at the records office in the same indirect way Miriam recommended things, sideways, and with plausible deniability. He practiced out of an office above the hardware store on Calder County's Main Street, in a space that smelled like old carpet and coffee that had been made too early and kept too long. He was in his late 50s and had the look of someone who had spent his career doing careful work for people who couldn't afford flashier options and had developed genuine competence as a result. Eleanor gave him the ledger from the satchel. She gave him the letter from the courthouse folder. She gave him the documentation from the auction. She described the root cellar, the boxes, their weight and construction. She described the conversation with Lucas on the drive home and the searches she had done at the clinic and the shape of what she thought she was looking at. Whitaker listened to all of it without interrupting. He read the letter twice. He examined the ledger without touching the pages, reading over it with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was looking at something that had legal dimensions not yet fully mapped. When she finished, he set the documents on his desk and looked at her over his glasses. He said, "You are describing a situation that is genuinely unusual, which is something I don't say often." He said that the legal framework around abandoned property, unclaimed assets, and assets held in informal trust without a surviving claimant was not simple and would require research. He said the letter was significant because it represented a documented statement of intent from the prior owner, and that she had acquired the property legally at public auction with clear title. He said there was a reasonable argument, which he would need to develop with some care, that the contents of the root cellar passed with the property and that she had standing to claim them. He said he would take the case on a contingency arrangement, which meant she would owe him nothing unless and until there was something to pay from. She asked what contingency meant in percentage terms. He said 15% of documented value, which was lower than standard, and that the reason it was lower than standard was that he was 62 years old and had spent 40 years doing careful work for people who couldn't afford flashier options and had not yet had a case that was what he would call genuinely interesting. She looked at him. He said, "This one is genuinely interesting." She signed the contingency agreement. She told him about the 30-day notice. He told her to do nothing about the bank until he had made some calls, because the acquisition of assets of potentially significant value would change the conversation considerably, and he preferred to have that conversation from a position of documented strength rather than foreclosure anxiety. She thanked him. She went home. That night, after Lily was asleep and Lucas had gone to his room, she sat at the kitchen table with the satchel in front of her and the crookedly hung curtains and the ceiling Daniel had painted twice, and she let herself think, just briefly, about what the boxes might contain. Not everything, not the full weight of it, just enough to let herself feel something other than fear for the first time in 14 months. The boxes were heavy. Harlan MacAllister had said so. Heavy in the way that gold is heavy, which is a specific kind of heavy that people who have held it describe as disproportionate, as if the object weighs more than it looks like it should, as if it is denser than the world expects. 18 boxes, 6 stacks of 3, each box approximately the size of a wine case, which meant approximately the dimensions that would accommodate a specific number of bars at a specific standard size. She did not let herself do the arithmetic. She was not going to sit at Daniel's kitchen table in the house they were losing and do arithmetic about a number she had no foundation to calculate. But she sat there for a while, in the quiet, and she let herself feel something that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but was the thing that exists in the space between them, the feeling that comes before you know but after you have reason to believe. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees at the edge of the yard. The sparrow that had sat near Lily was presumably somewhere warm and untroubled. The MacAllister orchard shed sat on its quarter-acre on Route 9 with its creeper vines and its leaning door and its seam in the floor that looked like nothing from above. Hers, for $12. She thought about Bud Hennessy saying someone had bought herself a magnificent pile of firewood. She thought about Gerald Potts's gavel and the sound it made. She closed the satchel and put it back under the floorboard and went to bed, and for the first time in 14 months, slept until morning. James Whitaker called the following Tuesday. His voice had the particular controlled quality of someone who has found something significant and is exercising discipline about how to communicate it. He said he had done his research. He said the situation was, as he had initially believed, genuinely unusual. He said that the legal framework around what he was now calling abandoned trust assets was not perfectly settled, but that there was substantial precedent for the position that items left in informal trust, with the trust relationship nullified by the death of both parties and no surviving claimant, and with the property subsequently passing through public auction with clear title, would transfer with the property rather than be subject to external claim. He said he had contacted an asset recovery specialist in Richmond, a man named Gordon Price, who dealt specifically with cases involving historical artifacts and stored valuables. He said Price had agreed to travel to Calder County to examine the contents of the root cellar under terms of strict confidentiality and professional privilege. He said that nothing was certain yet, that she should not make any financial commitments or discuss this with anyone who was not already in the circle of knowledge. She asked who was currently in that circle. He said, "You, your son, and me. And now Price, under binding confidentiality agreement." She asked when Price could come. He said Saturday morning. She asked if she should be there. He said absolutely. Gordon Price was not what Eleanor had expected, though she would have been unable to say exactly what she had expected. He was perhaps 45, compact, with the efficient movements of someone who had spent a career in tight spaces and confined environments. He drove a white van with no markings, which she had been told to expect. He carried a case of equipment that he did not explain in detail, but that included a handheld spectroscopic analyzer, specific gravity testing equipment, and a portable scale with a certification sticker from a county in Maryland. He went down the stairs of the root cellar without expression. He looked at the stacked boxes. He walked the perimeter of the space. He examined the walls and ceiling. He examined the boxes without touching them. Then he looked at Eleanor and said, "What's your theory?" She said, "Gold." He said, "What denomination?" She said she didn't know what that meant in this context. He said, "Bars, coins, dust, or alloy." "What's your read?" She said, "The boxes are too uniform for dust and too heavy for coins only." She said the dimensions were consistent with standard bar storage, assuming a specific configuration that she had looked up on the clinic's internet connection. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "That's a reasonable analysis." He took photographs of each box from multiple angles. He took photographs of the strap fastenings, the wood construction, the stack configuration. Then he removed from his case a tool she didn't recognize, something that looked like a very sophisticated stethoscope attached to a small electronic device, and he pressed it against the side of the nearest box and listened, or the machine listened, for approximately 30 seconds. He moved to each box in the same manner. He did not speak while he was doing this. When he was done, he turned to her. The room was very quiet. The cold air pressed around them from the stone walls, and above them through the floor. She could hear nothing because there was nothing to hear, just the shed sitting on its quarter-acre with its creeper vines and its crumbling eastern roof, looking like a $12 purchase, looking like a firewood pile, looking like a widow's emotional decision. Gordon Price said, "I'll need to open one to confirm. Do you want to be present for that?" She said yes. Obviously. He produced a bolt cutter for the strap mechanism, which he replaced after with a new strap from his case that was near identical to the original. The box lid required a thin pry tool applied with precision at 4 points. The wood was dense enough that this took some minutes. Inside was packing material, the Excelsior type, with shavings in dense layers that had kept their integrity in the controlled temperature environment of the root cellar across decades of storage. He removed the packing material carefully, by handfuls, setting it aside on the stone floor. Below the packing were bars. Gold bars. Cast. Each one approximately 10 inches by 3 inches by 1 3/4 inches, which she recognized from her research as consistent with a standard specification common to mid-century European and South American commercial gold production. Their surface was matte and dense with the unmistakable color that gold has in actual form, which is warmer and less dramatic than any photograph of it conveys, a color that is somehow organic and ancient at once. There were 12 bars in the box. Price lifted one with both hands and placed it on the portable scale. He noted the reading. He took the spectroscopic analyzer and pressed it to the surface of the bar and read the result on a small screen. He said, 995 fine. That's commercial purity. High grade. He put the bar back. He replaced the packing material. He refastened the box. He turned to her and said, assuming consistent contents across all 18 boxes, which the acoustic analysis suggests, and assuming the weight readings I'm getting are accurate, you are looking at approximately 6,000 gold bars. At current market value, which I would need to confirm with today's spot price, that represents a figure in the range of $300 million. Eleanor Marsh stood in the root cellar under the crumbling orchard shed she had bought for $12 with the bank's 30-day notice in her coat pocket and looked at a gold bar in a wooden box and breathed very carefully in and out. Then she turned to James Whitaker, who had come down the stairs at some point during this process and was standing against the wall with an expression she could not read, and she said, "All right, what do we do next?" He said, "First, we document everything. Then we contact the state, because the state has claims process requirements for assets of this magnitude. Then we go to a bank. Not your current bank." He paused. He said, "And then the bank calls the other bank, and then you give them back their letter." Outside, above them, in the $12 shed on the quarter-acre on Route 9, the October wind moved through the creeper vines and the gap in the eastern wall and the leaning barn door on its warped metal track. Bud Hennessy was somewhere down the road. Gloria Tatum was somewhere on Main Street. Gerald Potts was wherever auctioneers go on their days off from the work of assigning value to things. $308 million was sitting in a root cellar in the dark, exactly where it had been sitting for 60 years, waiting for someone to come down the stairs. Eleanor Marsh had come down the stairs. She was about to change everything. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources had a division that handled exactly the kind of situation Eleanor was describing, and the person who ran it was a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who had spent 23 years doing a job that almost nobody outside the profession knew existed. She arrived at the MacAllister shed on a Wednesday morning in a state vehicle with a colleague and a photographer, and she brought with her the particular energy of someone who has heard many things described as significant and has learned to wait until she sees them before deciding how to feel. James Whitaker had made the call on Eleanor's behalf, walking the state through the documentation in a sequence he had clearly planned in advance: the auction deed first, then the notarized letter from the courthouse folder, then Harlan MacAllister's ledger, then Gordon Price's preliminary assessment with its equipment certifications and his professional credentials attached. He gave them the shape of the situation before he gave them the location, and by the time Dr. Okafor arrived at Route 9, she had read everything and formed no visible conclusions. Eleanor met her at the gravel turnout. Lily was at school. Lucas had wanted to come, but Eleanor had told him no, that this was the part that required adults to conduct themselves with complete calm, and that she was not confident she could maintain complete calm while also monitoring his face for reactions. He had accepted this with the expression of someone who understood the logic and resented it simultaneously. Dr. Okafor shook her hand and looked at the shed without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "This is the structure." Eleanor said yes. The state official looked at the collapsed eastern section, the creeper vines, the leaning door. Then she looked at Eleanor. She said, "You bought this for $12. Eleanor said yes. Dr. Okafor said, "At a public county auction." Eleanor said yes. The state official looked back at the shed, and something moved across her face that was not quite a smile. She said, "Let's go look at the floor." The process that followed was meticulous in the way of government operations that understand they are creating a permanent record. The photographer documented every surface of the root cellar before anyone touched anything. Dr. Okafor's colleague, a man named Terrence who appeared to be in his early 30s and who carried equipment with the reverence of someone still new enough to the job to find it meaningful, took air samples and soil samples from the cellar floor. Dr. Okafor herself examined the stone construction, the chestnut beams, the shelving, and finally the 18 locked boxes, moving around them with attention that was almost forensic. She picked up the leather satchel, which Eleanor had returned to the cellar floor where she had found it, and examined it without opening it. She said, "This is mid-century construction, Argentine or Brazilian by the stitching style." She set it down carefully. She looked at the boxes for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to Whitaker and said, "Your client's claim is straightforward under the abandoned trust doctrine. The complicating factor is that assets of this potential magnitude trigger federal reporting requirements under several statutes, which means Treasury is going to want to be involved, and Treasury moves at its own pace." Whitaker said he was aware of this and had already drafted the relevant notifications. Dr. Okafor looked at Eleanor. She said, "I want to manage your expectations about timing. The authentication and claims process for something of this scale will take months, not weeks. The good news is that documentation of the claim creates a legal hold on the assets immediately, which means no one can remove or transfer them while the process is active. The bad news is that you will be waiting." Eleanor asked about the bank. Whitaker said, "That's my department." He produced a letter from his briefcase, one he had drafted and had Eleanor sign the night before, which he had addressed to the mortgage servicer and which outlined the situation in terms designed to communicate both the seriousness of what had been found and the expectation that the 30-day foreclosure timeline would be suspended pending the resolution of a material change in the client's financial circumstances. He had attached a copy of Price's preliminary assessment and a copy of the notarized MacAllister letter. He had also attached a brief note from his own office that used the phrase substantial assets currently under state authentication process in a way that implied, without stating, that the mortgage servicer would want to reconsider its posture. Dr. Okafor looked at the letter. She said, "You've been busy." Whitaker said, "My client has 30 days and 2 children." The state official nodded, a small movement that contained its own kind of respect. She said she would issue an official hold documentation within 48 hours and that Eleanor would receive a case number that could be referenced in any communications with the bank or any other creditor. Eleanor stood in the root cellar under the crumbling orchard shed with the 2 state officials and her attorney and 18 boxes of gold, and she thought about $47 minus 12. She thought about oatmeal stretched between 2 bowls. She thought about a sparrow sitting 2 feet from her daughter in the frost-hardened grass, as if it had been sent specifically for that purpose. She said thank you. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Dr. Okafor said, "Don't thank me yet. This is the beginning of a long process." Eleanor said, "I know. But it's a process, which is more than I had last week." The state official looked at her for a moment, then looked around the root cellar one more time, at the stone walls and the chestnut beams, and the 18 boxes, and the satchel on the floor with the compass inside it, and the ledger that an old man had written across 30 years of keeping faith with his word. She said, "Your auctioneer is going to be telling this story for the rest of his life." Eleanor thought about Gerald Potts's gavel and the clean sound it made in the October air. She said yes. I imagine he is. The mortgage servicer's response to Whitaker's letter arrived in 4 business days, which was considerably faster than mortgage servicers usually responded to anything. The tone had changed entirely. The word proceedings had been replaced with the phrase, "We look forward to working with you on a mutually beneficial resolution," which was the language institutions used when they understood that the power arrangement had shifted and were adjusting accordingly. The 30-day clock was suspended pending further documentation, which in practical terms meant that 4 Birchwood Lane remained Eleanor's for as long as the authentication process was active. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning before the children were up, with the curtains hanging slightly crooked in the early light, and she felt something release in her chest that she had not realized was locked there. Not relief exactly. More like the careful lowering of a weight that you had been holding in a position it was never meant to be held. She made coffee. She stood at the window and watched the yard go from gray to pale gold as the sun came up behind the tree line. She thought about calling her mother in Delaware, but decided to wait until there was more to say than the process has started, and we are not being evicted this month. Her mother would worry about the process, and Eleanor didn't have the bandwidth to manage her mother's worry on top of everything else. She called Miriam instead, from the back room at Whitfield's during a quiet hour, because Miriam would respond to this information with practical interest rather than panic, and because it had been Miriam who had mentioned the auction in the first place, and she deserved to know that the mention had mattered. She told Miriam that the MacAllister shed had turned out to be more than a pile of firewood. She told her there was a root cellar and that there were things in it that were currently being evaluated by the state, and that she was not at liberty to say more than that. Miriam was quiet for approximately 4 seconds, which was longer than Eleanor had ever heard Miriam be quiet about anything. Then Miriam said, "Eleanor Marsh, are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" Eleanor said she wasn't telling her anything, officially. She was mentioning that the property she had purchased for $12 contained something the state of Virginia considered worth evaluating at considerable institutional effort. Miriam said, "I told Bud Hennessy it was a good property when he was making his firewood jokes." She had done no such thing, and they both knew it. But Eleanor understood that Miriam's retellings of events improved on reality in ways that served her self-image, and that this was a survivable personality trait. She told Miriam that nothing was confirmed yet, and that she needed her to say nothing to anyone until it was. Miriam said, "Of course." She said it with the complete confidence of someone who had never successfully kept a piece of information to herself for more than 48 hours in her adult life. Eleanor understood this. She had calculated it into the conversation. Miriam telling people that something significant had been found at the MacAllister shed without being able to say what was the closest thing to controlled information management that Eleanor had available to her in Calder County, and it was better than the alternative, which was the uncontrolled version that would emerge eventually regardless. The next 3 weeks operated at 2 speeds simultaneously. At the official speed, things moved with the patient deliberateness of government authentication processes, forms submitted, responses received, specialists scheduled, documentation accumulated in manila folders that Whitaker organized with the precision of someone who understood that the details would matter. At the county speed, things moved considerably faster. Eleanor first knew that information was circulating when Ray Hennessy, Bud's brother, found an excuse to stop by Whitfield's on a day she happened to be working the front desk. Ray had no animals. He came in with a question about flea prevention for a dog that subsequent conversation established he did not currently own, and while he was there he mentioned, with studied casualness, that he'd heard there was some kind of situation out at the old MacAllister property on Route 9. Eleanor said she was not aware of any situation specifically. Ray said he'd heard something about the county being involved, some kind of assessment. She said assessments happened regularly on properties that changed hands at public auction. She said this in the same way she might have said anything factually accurate that was designed to be understood as confirmation without being legally provable as one. Ray left with a brochure about flea prevention that he had no use for and information that he would process overnight and share with his brother by morning. 2 days later, Gloria Tatum from the real estate office came in with her cat, which was real and was named Butterscotch and did have an ongoing ear situation. While Dr. Whitfield examined Butterscotch in the back room, Gloria sat in the waiting area with Eleanor and mentioned, conversationally, that she had seen a state vehicle out on Route 9 last week. And hadn't Eleanor just bought that shed property? Wasn't that a coincidence? Eleanor said Calder County was a small place and coincidences were more frequent than people recognized. Gloria looked at her with the assessing eyes of a woman whose profession required her to value things other people had already decided were worthless. There was something in the look that Eleanor had not seen there before. Not quite the pity of the auction morning. Something more complicated. The recalibration of someone who was beginning to wonder whether her initial read had been wrong. She said, "Eleanor, if you ever decide to put that property on the market, professionally speaking, I would love to talk to you about representation. I've always thought Route 9 was undervalued." Eleanor said she'd keep that in mind. It was Gerald Potts who called directly, which surprised her. She would not have thought Gerald Potts was a man who made direct calls to people he had processed at county auctions. But he was, apparently. He called Whitfield's on a Thursday afternoon and asked for her specifically, which Miriam relayed with an expression of barely contained delight. He said he understood there had been some developments regarding the MacAllister parcel. He said he wanted to make sure the county's auction records were complete and accurate in the event that any questions arose about the transaction. He said this in the careful language of a man covering institutional ground, making sure the paperwork was right, which Eleanor recognized as the behavior of someone who had started to understand that an auction he had run for $12 might be discussed in contexts considerably larger than a county parking lot. She told him the transaction had been straightforward and that the auction had been conducted properly. She said she had no reason to question any aspect of the county's process. She said this genuinely, because it was true, and she heard in the silence that followed that he understood she was choosing not to make his moment more difficult than it needed to be. He said thank you. He said it with the weight of a man who had made a comment about firewood and was now reckoning with what he had said it about. She said, "You're welcome, Mr. Potts." The federal involvement arrived in the form of a Treasury Department notification that Whitaker had anticipated and prepared for. The relevant statutes required that assets above a certain threshold discovered in the context of a property transfer be reported to the department, which then had 60 days to determine whether the assets had any connection to criminal activity, sanctioned entities, or outstanding government claims. This was the slowest part of the process and the most opaque. The federal timeline operated without regard for mortgage deadlines or children's school schedules or the particular anxiety of a woman watching a clock she couldn't see. Eleanor learned to live inside the waiting in the way that people learn to live inside difficult things when they have no alternative. She went to work at Whitfield's. She helped Lily with a school project about the Virginia ecosystem that required coloring-coded illustrations of bird species. She helped Lucas with a history paper on the New Deal. She made dinners from the same planning-required grocery budget she had always worked with because the money was not hers yet, and she was not going to change her life on the basis of a number that hadn't cleared federal review. Lucas watched her navigate this with the steady attention of a 15-year-old who had decided, somewhere in the months after his father died, that paying attention to his mother was a form of participation in the family's survival. He asked her one evening whether she was scared. She considered the question seriously before answering, because it deserved a serious answer. She said she was not scared exactly. She said she had been scared for 14 months, scared of the bank and the bills and the oil tank running down and the way she had not been enough by herself, and that what she felt now was something different. Not the absence of fear, but fear with a floor under it. Fear that had somewhere to stand. He said, "Okay." She said, "Are you scared?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his history paper with its notes about economic collapse and government intervention and the ways that catastrophe created conditions for change. Then he said, "I think I stopped being scared when you went back to that shed the second time." She asked why. He said, "Because you went back. You could have let it be $12 of nothing and gone home and kept being scared. But you went back with the flashlight and the pry bar and you made us go down the stairs." He paused. "Dad would have gone back, but I wasn't sure you would." Eleanor looked at her son in his father's jacket at the kitchen table and felt the full weight of what he had just said and what it had cost him to say it. She said, "I didn't know I would either." He nodded. He went back to the New Deal. She went back to whatever she had been doing, and neither of them mentioned it again. But it was there between them in the way that honest moments between people who love each other tend to stay. The federal 60-day review concluded on a Tuesday afternoon in December. Whitaker called her at the clinic and told her, in a voice that was carefully controlled in a way that communicated the opposite of its surface calm, that the Treasury Department had completed its review and found no evidence of any outstanding government claim or criminal nexus attached to the assets. He said the assets were clear. He said he was filing the formal ownership claim documentation that afternoon. She sat in the supply hallway at Whitfield's with her back against the cabinet that held surgical tape and said, "And then what happens?" He said, "And then the state certifies the claim, and then we arrange transfer." He said it would take another 3 to 4 weeks for the mechanics of the transfer to complete. He said the gold would be moved to a secure facility for final valuation, that the valuation would produce a certified number, and that after taxes and his 15%, she would receive the net proceeds. She asked what the certified number was likely to be. He said, "Gordon Price's preliminary figure has held up through every stage of the assessment." He said, $308 million. Give or take the spot price on the day of final valuation. Eleanor sat in the supply hallway at Whitfield's veterinary clinic on a December Tuesday and looked at a box of surgical tape and said nothing for what was probably 15 seconds. Whitaker said, "Eleanor, you still there?" She said yes. She said, "Is there anything I need to do today?" He said, "Go home. Have dinner with your children. Come see me Thursday, and we'll walk through the next steps." She said, "All right." She finished her shift. She picked up Lily from school and listened to a detailed account of a disagreement on the playground that had involved a disputed rule in a game whose rules were apparently very complex. She made pasta for dinner because pasta was what she made when she needed the mechanical comfort of a familiar process. She helped Lucas review for a math test. She did all of these things with the same care and the same attention she always brought to them, because they were her children's lives, and they deserved care and attention regardless of what was sitting in a secure facility being valued in another part of the state. But later, after Lily was asleep and Lucas had gone to his room, she sat in the living room with the light off and let the number sit with her in the dark. $308 million. She tried to understand it as a number and couldn't. She tried to understand it in relation to things she knew. The house at 4 Birchwood Lane with its crooked curtains was worth, at current market, approximately $240,000. $308 million was roughly 1,280 of those houses. She could buy 1,200 houses with what was in that root cellar and still have money remaining. She tried that calculation, and it didn't help either. The number was simply too large to hold in the frameworks she had for money, which were built around grocery budgets and oil tank refills, and whether $47 would cover the week. She sat with it anyway, in the dark, until she could feel the shape of it, even if she couldn't quite see the edges. Then she went to bed. The final valuation came in on the 14th of December, which was a Friday, which meant that Eleanor heard the number for the first time on the same day that Lily's school held its winter concert, and that Lily sang in the second row of the chorus wearing a green dress that had been her only dress for 3 months and had held up with the particular resilience of a garment that has been washed carefully and often. Eleanor sat in the school auditorium watching her daughter sing and felt the number sitting in her coat pocket like a physical thing, folded into the copy of the valuation summary Whitaker had handed her that afternoon. $308 million for $100,000. Final certified valuation. Gross, before taxes and fees. She watched Lily sing. The concert was 35 minutes. Afterward, Lily found her in the crowd with the specific urgency of a 9-year-old who has performed and needs immediate confirmation of excellence. Eleanor held her daughter and said she had been wonderful. She said it with complete honesty because Lily had been wonderful, and because the particular combination of emotions in her chest at that moment required an outlet, and Lily's green dress and the warmth of her small body was the best one available. Lucas was standing slightly apart from them in the way of 15-year-olds at school events. She caught his eye. He raised his eyebrows in the question he had been too careful to ask all day. She gave him the smallest possible nod. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at her, and something crossed his face that she had not seen there in 14 months. Something that was not relief or gratitude or triumph, but was all of those things compressed into an expression that a 15-year-old boy makes when the worst period of his life finally, verifiably, ends. She said they should celebrate. She said they were going to the diner for dinner, not the grocery store. Lily said she wanted pancakes for dinner. Eleanor said pancakes for dinner was exactly what they were going to have. They went to the diner. They had pancakes. Lucas had a hamburger and pancakes. Lily had pancakes and a hot chocolate with marshmallows, which she normally was not allowed during the week because of sugar at bedtime, and which Eleanor allowed tonight without discussion. They sat in a booth by the window, and outside the December dark of Calder County pressed against the glass, and inside it was warm and smelled like coffee and maple syrup and the particular comfort of a place that has been feeding people consistently for a long time. She did not tell them the number at the diner. She had decided she would tell them the number at home, quietly, without an audience, because the number belonged to their family, and she wanted them to receive it in a family setting. But she told them that everything was going to be all right. She told them this in the direct way she had learned to say things since Daniel died, without cushioning, without qualification. She said, "We are going to be all right. The shed turned out to be what I thought it might be. More than I thought, actually. We are going to be more than all right." Lily said she knew. She said it with the serenity of a 9-year-old who has not fully lived inside the fear that the adults around her have been managing. Lucas said, "How much more than all right?" Eleanor said, "Thursday. At home." He accepted this with the patience he had developed over weeks of watching her manage a process at a pace she didn't control. The word had gotten out considerably further by the time the formal ownership transfer completed in the week before Christmas. Eleanor had not been the source, and Miriam's contributions had been limited by not knowing the actual number, but the combination of county auction records, state assessment vehicles visible on Route 9, and the general permeability of small-town information systems had produced a picture that was increasingly accurate without being officially confirmed. She knew this because of the way people behaved when she encountered them, a shift in register that was unmistakable once you had seen it. The particular quality of attention that people bring to someone they have recently reevaluated. The careful friendliness of people who want to be on good terms with someone whose circumstances have changed. Bud Hennessy was the clearest example. She encountered him at the hardware store on a Saturday morning when she had gone in for a tube of weather stripping. He was behind the counter when she came in, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw her was one she found genuinely interesting. It was not shame exactly. Bud Hennessy was not a man built for shame. It was closer to the expression of someone who has made a bet with supreme confidence and is watching the outcome develop in a direction he did not account for. A recalibration that was uncomfortable because it required acknowledging that the initial calibration had been wrong. He said, "Eleanor." His voice had a warmth in it that had not been there at the county auction parking lot. She said, "Bud." She said it without additional warmth and without coldness, in the tone of someone who was there to buy weather stripping and had not gone out of her way to create this encounter. He said he'd heard there'd been some news about the MacAllister property. She said she'd heard that too. He said, "So it worked out then." She looked at him for a moment with the direct gaze she had developed in the months of having nothing to lose, which conferred a particular kind of freedom in moments like this one. She said it worked out. She paid for her weather stripping. She thanked him. She left. Outside in the December cold, she stood for a moment by her car and let herself feel something she had been keeping in a box since October. Not vindication exactly. Vindication implied that proving the mockers wrong had been part of the purpose. It hadn't been. She had bought that shed because of the seam in the floor and the dryness of the planks and the instinct of a woman who had spent 14 months reading situations with the precision that desperation teaches. The firewood jokes had been background noise, information about the people making them rather than intelligence about the decision itself. But standing in the December cold outside the hardware store, she felt something that was adjacent to vindication. The feeling of having been right in a context where everyone assumed you were wrong, and of that rightness being now undeniable and permanent and requiring no further defense. It was a good feeling. She let herself have it for approximately 30 seconds. Then she got in the car and drove home to install the weather stripping before the afternoon got any colder. Gloria Tatum called the following week, and the call was different in character from all previous interactions with Gloria Tatum. Gone was the sympathetic neutrality of the auction morning, the careful language of liability disclaimers about unimproved properties. What replaced it was the energetic warmth of a real estate professional who had understood the situation and adjusted her position accordingly, and was not going to waste either of their time pretending the adjustment hadn't happened. She said, "Eleanor, first I want to say congratulations." She said it genuinely, or in the register that was as close to genuine as Gloria Tatum was capable of on a professional call. Eleanor said thank you. Gloria said she had been thinking about the Route 9 property and its potential, and she wondered if Eleanor had given any thought to its future. She mentioned that land values in that corridor had been moving in interesting directions. She mentioned that a quarter-acre with a historic structure and a documented provenance story of this kind was in a category she had not personally worked with before, and she would love to discuss options. Eleanor said she appreciated the call. She said she had not yet made decisions about the property's future and that she would keep Gloria in mind. She said this in the tone of someone who had made no promises and intended to make none. Gloria said, of course. She said she hoped Eleanor knew that if there was anything she could do to help, she should just say the word. Eleanor said she'd remember that. After she hung up, she sat for a moment thinking about the word help and the difference between people who offered it when you needed it and people who offered it when it was no longer needed. She thought about Dr. Whitfield, who had kept her on part-time through 14 months of financial crisis without asking questions that were not his to ask. She thought about the records office clerk with the reading glasses on a beaded chain, who had handed over the MacAllister folder without commentary and let her do her work. She thought about James Whitaker, who had described her case as genuinely interesting and had set his fee at 15% when the standard would have been more, and who had sent a letter to the mortgage servicer on the basis of a preliminary assessment and a dead man's notarized declaration. She thought about the people who had helped when helping cost them something. Those were the people she was going to remember. Lucas asked her on a Sunday afternoon, 3 days before Christmas, whether she felt different. They were sitting on the back porch in the cold because Lucas had wanted fresh air, and the house had felt small to him in the way houses feel to teenagers who are in the middle of large thoughts. Eleanor had brought her coffee. Lucas had his father's jacket. She considered the question the way she had learned to consider his questions, because he was 15 and asking from a place of genuine inquiry rather than small talk. She said, "Not yet, in the way I think you mean." She said the money was real and the legal process was complete and the bank had been notified and the 30-day letter was not going to be followed by another 30-day letter. She said all of those things were facts and they had changed the structural reality of their lives. But she said that she still woke up at 3 in the morning sometimes with the weight she had been carrying for 14 months, and that the weight didn't evaporate overnight just because the circumstances had changed. The body learned things, she said, and unlearned them more slowly than the mind did. Lucas thought about this. He said, "I still check the oil tank." She said, "I know." He said, "I check it every day. I've been checking it since November when it got low." He said it the way people say things they have been holding privately, not with drama, but with the relief of setting something down. She said, "You never told me." He said, "I didn't want to worry you. You had enough to worry about." She looked at her son, this 15-year-old who had been checking the oil tank every day so that she wouldn't have to add it to the list of things she was managing, and she felt the love she had for him as a physical thing in her chest, dense and warm and vast. She said, "You can. Stop checking the oil tank." He said, "I know." He said, "I know I can. But I might keep doing it for a while anyway." She said that was all right. She said that was more than all right. They sat on the back porch in the December cold and drank their coffee and wore their respective jackets, and after a while Lily came out to join them because she had been watching from the window and had decided the back porch scene required her presence. She was wearing 4 layers of clothes over her pajamas and carrying a stuffed animal, and the 3 of them sat together in the cold until it became unreasonably cold even for people who had decided to sit in it, and then they went inside. The formal transfer of funds cleared on the 22nd of December, 2 years and 3 months, almost to the day, from the morning Daniel Marsh had died in the hospital in Roanoke and left his family standing in a corridor trying to understand what happened to the rest of their lives. After taxes and after Whitaker's 15%, Eleanor's net was $194 million. She sat in Whitaker's office on the afternoon of the 22nd, and he showed her the account statement, and she looked at the number with 9 zeros and the comma in the right place, and she felt, of all the things she had expected to feel, a particular and overwhelming tiredness. Not a bad tiredness. The tiredness that follows sustained effort when the effort finally concludes, when the muscles that have been working can finally rest. Whitaker had arranged for a financial advisor to be present, a woman from Richmond named Patricia Holt who specialized in what she described, without apparent self-consciousness, as sudden wealth situations. Patricia Holt had brought a plan, detailed and conservative, built around the principle that money of this magnitude was most reliably preserved by treating it with the same sobriety that the absence of it required. She used the word stewardship several times. She talked about trusts and foundations and the specific tax structures that would protect long-term security. Eleanor listened to everything. She asked precise questions and wrote the answers in a notebook she had brought. She said she would need time to review the recommendations before making decisions. She thanked Patricia Holt for coming and told her she would be in touch. After Patricia left, Whitaker looked at Eleanor across his desk. He said, "First thing." She said, "First thing." She pulled out the letter from the mortgage servicer, the original 30-day notice, the one that had arrived on the morning she was stretching oatmeal between two bowls. She had kept it. She had not been sure why she was keeping it until now, and now she understood. She said, "I want to wire the full payoff balance today. Not negotiate a payment plan. Not refinance. Full payoff. Today." Whitaker said, "Consider it done." She said, "And I want a letter. From the bank. Formal. Saying the account is satisfied and the lien is released." He said, "They'll send it in due course." She said, "I want it before Christmas." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called the mortgage servicer's loss mitigation department directly, which she had not known attorneys could do, but which turned out to be a thing attorneys could do when they called on behalf of a client who was wiring the full payoff balance that day. He spoke to 3 people in ascending order of authority. He used the phrase full payoff wire transfer initiating this afternoon in a way that produced immediate cooperation from parties who had been generating 30-day notices for the better part of a year. The letter arrived by courier on the 23rd of December. Eleanor signed for it at the door of 4 Birchwood Lane and stood in the doorway with it and read the language that said the account was satisfied and the lien was released, and that the property at 4 Birchwood Lane was free and clear and belonging entirely and without encumbrance to Eleanor and Marsh. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer, the one where she kept the important documents, alongside the deed to the MacAllister shed parcel on Route 9. Lily asked at dinner what had come in the mail. Eleanor said it was just paperwork. Lucas looked at her over his pasta. She looked back. They conducted a complete conversation in the silence of 2 people who had been reading each other through a long and difficult experience and had learned to hear what the other person wasn't saying. He said, "Good paperwork or bad paperwork?" She said, "Very good paperwork." He went back to his pasta with the look of someone who had processed important information and filed it in the correct category. The afternoon of the 23rd, Eleanor drove out to Route 9 alone. She parked at the gravel turnout and walked through the knee-high grass to the MacAllister shed, the same path she had walked on the October afternoon when she had first pressed her hand against the leaning door and smelled apples and thyme. The shed looked the same as it always had. The creeper vines were dormant now, their structures visible without their leaves, a skeletal architecture clinging to the boards. The collapsed eastern section was the same. The leaning door on its warped track was the same. From the road, it looked exactly like what everyone at the county auction had seen. An abandoned structure. A pile of firewood waiting to be appreciated as such. She pushed the door open on its warped track. She went inside. She crossed the floor to the far end and crouched down and put her hand on the seam that ran at right angles to the plank direction and felt the iron ring, still flush with the wood, still invisible unless you were looking for it. The root cellar was empty now. The 18 boxes had been removed under official supervision, documented in photographs and transfer records, taken to the secure facility where they had been valued and from where the value had made its way, through the banking system, into an account with her name on it. The stone walls were still there. The chestnut beams. The empty shelving on 3 sides. The faint ghost of apples in the dry, cold air. She sat on the bottom step of the stone staircase and looked at the empty space for a while. She thought about Harlan MacAllister sitting in this orchard for 40 years with a secret in the ground beneath it, keeping faith with his word through 3 decades of apple harvests and county tax notices and the slow erosion of an old man's body. She thought about the particular integrity that required, the refusal to profit from something that wasn't yours to profit from, the stubborn maintenance of a promise even when the other party was gone and no one would ever know. She thought about what he had written in his ledger on his 70th birthday, that a man's word given in confidence was his word even if the other man was dead. She thought about deserving a bit of luck. She thought about $12. She sat in the empty root cellar of the MacAllister orchard shed on the afternoon of the 23rd of December, and she let herself understand, fully and without the protective layer of uncertainty she had been carrying since October, what had happened. A man she had never met had kept a secret for 30 years because he was the kind of man who kept secrets. He had written it down so that whoever came next would understand. He had trusted that the mechanism of property and time would deliver his trust to the right hands. He had written a letter to whoever it may concern and filed it in a courthouse folder where it waited for someone to look for it. She had looked for it. She had driven to the records office on a Tuesday afternoon with a theory and a need, and she had looked for it, and she had found it, and she had been right. She stayed in the root cellar until the December light through the shed above her faded to the point where she needed the flashlight she had brought. Then she climbed the stairs and pulled the hatch closed behind her and slid the leaning door shut as far as it would go on its warped track and walked back through the dormant grass to her car. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she drove home to her children. Christmas Eve arrived with the particular clarity of cold weather and short days and the year pressing toward its end. Lucas had asked her what they were going to do differently now, meaning in a practical sense, meaning school and house and the immediate texture of their lives. Eleanor had told him that they were not going to do things differently overnight, because overnight changes to the structure of a life were how people made the kind of mistakes that undid good fortune faster than bad luck could have managed. She told him that they were going to make decisions carefully and in order, and that the first decisions were already made. The mortgage was satisfied, the house was theirs, and they were not going anywhere. He said, "What about the second decisions?" She said, "Those are for January." He said, "And the third decisions?" She said, "Also for January." He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that were his father's and said, "You're going to be really boring about this, aren't you?" She said, "I am going to be spectacularly boring about this." He said, "Good." He said it with relief that had been waiting to be expressed, the relief of a 15-year-old who had been managing adult-scale anxiety for 14 months and who wanted, with a fervor he would not have been able to articulate, for the adults in his life to be boring and stable and uninteresting in their decision-making. Eleanor had one thing she wanted to do before January. One thing she had planned since the afternoon in Whitaker's office when she had instructed him to wire the payoff balance. On Christmas morning, before the children were up, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote 3 letters by hand. The first was to Dr. Whitfield. It thanked him for not asking questions he didn't need to ask and for keeping her on when keeping her on required more faith in her than the circumstances supported. It enclosed a check for an amount sufficient to fund 2 years of veterinary technician scholarships at the community college, which she knew he had wanted to establish for years and had not been able to fund. The second was to the records office clerk with the reading glasses on a beaded chain, whose name she had subsequently learned was Margaret Pruitt. It thanked her for retrieving the MacAllister folder without commentary and for the particular professional grace of letting a person do their work without interference. It enclosed a check for an amount she thought might cover a trip that Margaret Pruitt had mentioned once, offhandedly, to her coworker in Eleanor's hearing, a trip to see her sister in Portugal that she had been putting off for 3 years. The third letter was the one she had been thinking about the longest. She addressed it to Gerald Potts. She thanked him for conducting the county auction with the accuracy and professionalism his office required. She told him she held no resentment for any aspect of the transaction. She told him that the gavel sound on that October morning was one she would remember for the rest of her life. She told him she hoped his children were well and that he had a good Christmas and that she wished him nothing but good luck in his career. She did not enclose a check for Gerald Potts. The letter was the thing. The communication, from a position she would not have occupied if he had done anything differently, that she bore him no ill will and required nothing from him by way of reckoning or apology or acknowledgement, that the universe had arranged things in a way she found satisfying and she was content to leave it there. She sealed the letters. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table in the early Christmas morning quiet of 4, Birchwood Lane and listened to the house that was hers, free and clear and belonging entirely to Eleanor and Marsh, settle around her in the cold. The curtains were still crooked. She was going to fix them eventually. But not today. Today they were a Daniel detail, part of the specific vocabulary of a life they had built together that she was not ready to edit. Today they were exactly right. Upstairs, she heard Lily wake. The particular sounds of a 9-year-old on Christmas morning, the immediate orientation toward what the day meant, the movement toward the stairs. Eleanor put her coffee down and went to the bottom of the stairs to meet her daughter. Behind her, through the crooked curtains, the December morning was coming up golden over Calder County, over the Route 9 corridor, over the quarter-acre with its dormant creeper vines, and its leaning barn door, and its empty root cellar that still smelled faintly of apples and thyme, and 60 years of one man's faithfulness to his word. The $12 shed was still standing. Everything else had changed. She pulled Lily into a hug at the bottom of the stairs and held her daughter for a moment longer than she normally would have, long enough that Lily looked up at her with the searching expression children use when they are trying to understand what the hug is actually about. Eleanor said, "Good morning." Lily said, "Are you crying?" Eleanor said, "Just a little." Lily considered this. She said, "Is it a good crying or a bad crying?" Eleanor said, "It's the best kind. The kind where everything is okay." Lily accepted this and transferred her attention to the living room, where the tree was, and the specific question of what Christmas morning had produced. She ran ahead in her 4 layers of clothes over her pajamas, and Eleanor followed her, listening to the particular joy that children carry in their voices on mornings like this one, the uncomplicated delight of a day that belongs entirely to the simple pleasures of being alive and together and warm. Lucas appeared at the top of the stairs a few minutes later. He came down slowly, the way teenagers come downstairs when they want to appear indifferent to Christmas, while not actually being indifferent to Christmas. He stopped on the bottom step and looked at his mother in the living room with Lily, and she looked back at him, and she saw the same thing in his face she had seen at the school concert. That specific expression, the one that did not have a name, but that meant the worst period of his life had ended. He stepped off the bottom stair. He said, "Merry Christmas." She said, "Merry Christmas, Lucas." And the day began. January arrived the way January always arrives in the Virginia foothills, without ceremony, with cold that meant business, with the particular quality of light that belongs to the first month of a new year, pale and clean and carrying no residue from what came before. Eleanor Marsh sat at the kitchen table on the second day of it and opened a notebook to the first page and began writing a list. She had been thinking about the list since the afternoon in Whitaker's office when Patricia Holt had presented her stewardship plan. She had been thinking about it through Christmas, about what a life rebuilt carefully looked like, not the fantasy version that people construct before they understand what large sums of money actually require, but the real version. The version that started with what the people in it actually needed and built outward from there. The first thing she wrote was the house. She wrote it not as a reminder, but as an anchor, the fixed point around which everything else would organize. The house at 4 Birchwood Lane was paid off, free and clear, and she was not going to sell it. She had considered this question more carefully than anyone watching from outside might have expected. She had $194 million and was choosing to continue living in a house worth $240,000. People were going to have opinions about that. She had decided she did not particularly care what people had opinions about, which was a position she had been moving toward for 14 months and had arrived at fully sometime around the afternoon. She sat in the empty root cellar and let the weight of what had happened settle into her bones. The house was where her children had grown up. It was where Daniel had painted the ceiling twice because she hadn't liked the first color. It was where Lucas had come home from his first day of middle school looking like he had survived something and not sure what. It was where Lily had asked, with the directness of small children, whether their father was in the sky or in the ground, and Eleanor had said, with the honesty that question deserved, both. The house had the crooked curtains, and the ceiling, and the kitchen table, and the morning light through the window that fell exactly the way it fell nowhere else. She was not trading that for a house in a different neighborhood that would impress people she did not need to impress. She was going to renovate it, though. That was on the list. Carefully and with intention, preserving everything that was right about the structure while addressing everything that had been deferred for years by the economics of survival. The furnace that worked, but worked poorly. The bathroom that needed new tile and new fixtures. The garage where Daniel's toolbox still sat on a shelf gathering the kind of dust that accumulates when someone is gone and the people who loved him can't quite bring themselves to reorganize his things. She wrote down Patricia Holt's investment recommendations in summary form. The trusts and the funds and the structures that would turn a large number into a stable long-term security rather than a fast diminishing fortune. She wrote down the education accounts for Lucas and for Lily, fully funded at amounts that would cover whatever paths they chose without making the choice for them. She wrote down the emergency fund, 6 months of expenses at the new, comfortable level of expenses rather than the survival level, always available, never touched unless it was genuinely needed. She wrote down the orchard shed. This was the item she had been thinking about the longest, and the one for which she had the clearest vision. The MacAllister shed on its quarter-acre on Route 9 was hers, and was going to remain hers, and she was going to do something with it that honored what it had been and what it had made possible. She had been turning the idea around since December, and it had taken its final shape on Christmas night, when she was lying in bed listening to the house settle. She wrote the details in the notebook, and when she had written them, she read them back, and they were right. The renovation work on the house at Birchwood Lane began in the 3rd week of January. Eleanor had hired a contractor named Frank Osei, who had been recommended by 3 separate people with no connection to each other, which she had learned was the most reliable form of professional reference. He was methodical and unhurried and spoke about the house's bones with the respect that people who understand old construction bring to things that were built to last. He walked through every room with her before touching anything, asking questions that established what she wanted to preserve and what she needed to change. When he reached the living room and saw the crooked curtains, he started to say something about the rod. She said, "Leave those." He noted it without comment in the way of contractors who have learned that clients have reasons for the things they want preserved, and that those reasons are none of the contractor's business. Lucas had asked, 2 weeks into January, whether he could start looking at colleges. Eleanor had been waiting for this question. She had been waiting for him to be ready to ask it, because she understood that 15-year-olds who have spent a year and a half in survival mode approach good news with the caution of someone who has learned not to trust it until it has proven itself stable. She had not wanted to push him toward future planning before he was ready to stand in the future without flinching. She said yes. She said he could look at any college anywhere, and that cost was not a factor he needed to consider. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Anywhere." She said, "Anywhere." He had gone to his room, and she had heard him at his computer for the next 2 hours. She did not ask what he had been looking at. She understood that the looking was the thing, not the deciding. The act of allowing himself to consider options he had spent 14 months not allowing himself to consider was its own form of recovery, and it did not require her participation. He came to breakfast the next morning and mentioned, casually, that MIT had a particularly good engineering program. He mentioned this while pouring cereal, with the elaborate nonchalance of someone who had been rehearsing casualness for a day and had not quite achieved it. She said, "I've heard that." He said, "Just interesting." She said, "Very interesting." They ate their cereal and said nothing more about it. But he was smiling in the slightly suppressed way of people who have allowed themselves to want something and discovered that the wanting doesn't immediately destroy them. Lily's adjustments were less strategic and more immediate. She wanted new books, which Eleanor bought her in stacks from the bookstore in town. She wanted a specific kind of art supply she had seen on a video at school. She wanted to learn to ride a horse, which Eleanor filed away and was already planning in connection with the larger project on Route 9. She wanted, with the straightforward desire of a child who had been cold for 2 winters, a bedroom that was always warm enough to read in her pajamas without extra layers. Eleanor had Frank Osei make Lily's room the first one he touched. New insulation in the walls, a new baseboard system, a window that sealed properly. Lily moved back in on a Thursday evening and sat in the middle of her bed in her pajamas with a book and the particular satisfaction of a 9-year-old who has been granted exactly what she needed and knows it. She said, "It's warm." Eleanor said, "It is." Lily said, "Like our house is a hug." Eleanor said, "That's exactly what a house is supposed to be." The news of Eleanor's acquisition and its outcome had by January become a story that Calder County had organized around in the way that small communities organize around the things that happen in them, not quite as legend and not quite as current events, but as something in between, a reference point that people used in conversation to locate their own position relative to something significant. "You heard about the Marsh woman and the MacAllister shed" was a sentence that led to other sentences, depending on who was saying it and to whom. The sentences varied. Among the people who had been at the auction, they tended toward the retrospective, the recounting of what they had seen and said and done on that October morning, with the subtle adjustments that memory makes to preserve self-image. Bud Hennessy's firewood remark, Eleanor had been told indirectly and reliably, had been transformed in his retelling into an appreciation of the property's potential that his brother Ray had misunderstood. This did not surprise her. She did not take issue with it. People wrote themselves into the stories of the moments they had witnessed, and the writing was its own form of acknowledgement that the moment had mattered. Among people who had not been at the auction, the story tended toward the larger meaning, the version that extracted a lesson about overlooked value and patient observation in the ways that conventional wisdom fails the people who need it most. This version found Eleanor more interesting as a protagonist than she found herself, which she accepted as the cost of having a story that other people wanted to tell. What she noticed, moving through Calder County in January, was the shift in register she had first observed after the federal review cleared. It had intensified and settled into something more permanent, a baseline respect that operated differently from the sympathy that had preceded it. People who had looked at her with careful pity, seeing a widow with a veterinary clinic phone job and a mortgage notice, now looked at her with careful attention, seeing someone they had underestimated and were not going to underestimate again. She found she did not particularly need either form of attention, which was its own kind of freedom. The approval and the disapproval of Calder County had been relevant when she depended on its institutional goodwill to survive. Now it was information about the people expressing it rather than a force with power over her circumstances. She was not unkind about it. She understood that most people were simply people, doing the things people did, adjusting their assessments as new information became available. She did not require apology or reckoning from anyone who had been at that auction. The story had resolved itself in a way she found complete. There was one exception. She went to see Bud Hennessy at the farm supply store on a Wednesday morning in the second week of January. She did not go to confront him or to make a point. She went because she had something to say, and she believed in saying things directly to the person who needed to hear them. The store was quiet at 10 on a weekday. Bud was at the counter reviewing an invoice when she came in. The expression that crossed his face when he saw her was more complex than the one from the hardware store in December. He had had more time to think since then, and the thinking had done its work. He said, "Eleanor." She said, "Bud." She said she had something for him, and she put a small card on the counter. On the card was the name of a contractor in Richmond who specialized in root cellar renovation and preservation of historical agricultural structures. She had written a note on the back that said this contractor had experience with structures of the MacAllister sheds type and period and was available for consultation. Bud looked at the card. He looked at her. She said, "You've got that old bank barn out on your eastern parcel, the one you've been meaning to look at for 3 years." She said she had been thinking about what was worth preserving in Calder County and what wasn't, and that the Hennessy barn was worth preserving, and that Franco say had mentioned the roof needed immediate attention or the whole structure was going to go the way of the MacAllister shed's eastern section. She said this without any additional meaning attached to it, or with exactly as much additional meaning as Bud Hennessy was capable of extracting, which was sufficient. He picked up the card. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Take care of the barn, Bud. Old buildings remember what happened inside them. That's worth something." She left. She did not look back. But she was fairly sure, from the silence that followed her out the door, that the message had landed exactly where she had intended it. The MacAllister Shed project broke ground in February, which required breaking actual ground, and also breaking the legal ground of rezoning the quarter-acre parcel from agricultural use to cultural and educational use, which Whitaker handled with his usual methodical precision. The plan was this. The shed would be restored, not renovated, which meant returning it to structural soundness while preserving the character of what it had been. The eastern section of roof would be rebuilt using materials consistent with the original construction. The siding boards would be replaced where necessary with matching material. The leaning door would be adjusted to hang properly on its track while retaining the track and the hardware. The floor, with its wide chestnut boards and its hidden seam with the iron ring, would be preserved exactly as it was. The root cellar would be restored and open to visitors. This was the center of the plan. The root cellar that had held 60 years of locked boxes would become accessible, reached by the same stone stairs that Eleanor and Lucas had descended on that October afternoon with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. The shelving would be restored to the condition it had been in when Harlan MacAllister was running his orchard. The empty wooden boxes, replicas made from the same tropical hardwood as the originals, would be stacked against the back wall in the configuration Gordon Price had documented. A small display at the foot of the stairs would tell the story. Not all of the story. The story that required legal filings and federal review and a spectroscopic analyzer and a portable scale was not the story the display would tell. The display would tell Harlan MacAllister's story. The man who had kept faith with his word for 30 years. Who had written in his ledger in handwriting that grew smaller and more cramped over decades. Who had described, on his 70th birthday, what it meant to give your word and keep it. The display would include a reproduction of that ledger entry. It would include a photograph of the orchard as it had been, sourced from the County Historical Society, which had, it turned out, 12 photographs of the MacAllister operation from the 1950s and 60s that had been sitting in a box without a home. It would include a reproduction of the letter from the courthouse folder, the notarized declaration addressed to whoever it may concern. At the center of the display, behind glass, under a light chosen for warmth rather than clinical clarity, would be Harlan MacAllister's compass. The brass one with H, J, M, 1943 stamped on the back. She had spoken to Whitaker about it, and he had confirmed that the compass, as a personal effect found with the satchel that was itself found with the property, was hers. She was returning it to the property from which it had come, placing it back in the root cellar where Harlan MacAllister had left it, where it could be seen and not taken, remembered and not lost. She had written the interpretive text herself, in draft, and had shown it to Whitaker and to James Walsh, who had taught history for 22 years before moving to county legal work, and who had a feel for the difference between language that informed and language that lectured. Walsh had changed 3 sentences and left the rest. He said it was honest, which was the quality he most valued in historical interpretation and the one most frequently absent from it. The last paragraph of the interpretive text read, Harlan MacAllister never knew whether anyone would find what he left behind or what they would do with it. He only knew that keeping a trust was its own justification, regardless of witness or reward. This building stands because he believed that. Whatever it holds now, it holds because of what he was. Eleanor read this paragraph several times during the drafting process. She read it in the way you read things that say something you have been trying to say and haven't found the words for. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the second mortgage and the Roanoke project and the lawsuit and the legal fees and the nothing. She had spent 14 months constructing a version of Daniel's choices that she could live with, that allowed her to be angry at the decisions without being angry at the person, to grieve the loss without being consumed by what the loss had revealed. It was careful psychological work, the kind that you do in the dark at 3 a.m. when the weight of a complicated love presses down on you with the full gravity of its contradiction. Harlan MacAllister's story had helped her with this in a way she had not expected. The old man had made a choice that was not the financially rational one. He had sat with a root cellar full of gold for 30 years and never opened the boxes, never used the contents to ease whatever difficulties had come his way in 40 years of running an apple orchard in Calder County, Virginia. He had chosen integrity over advantage and had done it quietly, without audience, and had died without knowing whether the choice would ever matter to anyone. Daniel had made different choices. He had chosen something that had looked like ambition but turned out to be fear, the fear of being insufficient, of not providing what he thought a husband and father should provide, of watching his family not have enough without doing something about it regardless of whether the something was wise. The choices had been wrong and had cost his family everything. But underneath the choices was the same impulse, the desire to protect the people he loved. She could see both things at once now, the failure and the love that motivated it. She had not been able to see them both at once for a long time. The compass was going back in the root cellar, and something of Daniel was being preserved in the house on Birchwood Lane, in the crooked curtains and the ceiling he had painted twice, in the toolbox in the garage that she had not moved and would not move, in the jacket on Lucas's shoulders that still smelled like him on cold mornings. The dead kept their place in the living world. It was one of the things she had learned. The MacAllister Heritage Center, which was the name the project had accumulated during its development, opened on a Saturday morning in late April when the Virginia foothills were doing what they did best, which was going green in stages from the creek bottoms upward in a progression that felt deliberately theatrical, as if the landscape understood it had an audience and was performing for it. Eleanor had not organized a formal opening ceremony. She had considered it and rejected it because formal opening ceremonies tend to be about the person opening the thing rather than the thing being opened, and the thing being opened was about Harlan MacAllister and about the idea that some people kept faith with their word even when no one was watching. She did not want to make it about herself. What she had done instead was invite people to come by on a Saturday morning, mentioned through the same informal channels that had spread every other piece of information through Calder County over the previous 6 months. She had put a simple card in the window of Whitfield's veterinary clinic and one at Margaret Pruitt's records office and one at the library. She had told Miriam, which was the county equivalent of public broadcast. By 10 in the morning, there were 40 people standing in the dormant grass around the MacAllister shed, which looked, from the road, almost exactly as it had always looked except that the eastern roof was sound now and the door hung properly on its track, and someone had carefully trimmed back the creeper vines to reveal the siding beneath without removing the vines entirely, because the vines were part of what the place was and deserved to remain. Gerald Potts was there. He stood near the back of the group with his hands in his coat pockets and his expression that of a man processing a considerable number of simultaneous thoughts. Eleanor noticed him and did not go to him and did not avoid him. She allowed the event to organize itself around what it was, which was an acknowledgement that a place had a story worth knowing and that the story was now available to be known. Miriam was there, wearing a coat that suggested she had dressed for the occasion, telling the people nearest to her a version of events that positioned her own role more centrally than the historical record supported. Eleanor heard a fragment and found it genuinely amusing. Miriam's revision had her specifically encouraging Eleanor to attend the auction based on her professional assessment of the property's undervalued potential. Eleanor let it stand. The important thing was that Miriam had mentioned the auction in the first place. Gloria Tatum was there with a notepad, which Eleanor had expected. Gloria had found a new professional interest in what she was calling experiential heritage properties and was presenting it to clients as an underexplored corner of the market. Eleanor bore her no ill will. Gloria was doing what Gloria did, converting every development in the world around her into a professional opportunity. It was a resilient way to live. Dr. Sandra Okafor came from Richmond, which Eleanor had not expected and which meant more than she could easily say. The state official had driven 2 hours on a Saturday morning to stand in the grass outside a quarter-acre parcel on Route 9 and watch people go down the stairs of a root cellar. She brought a colleague Eleanor didn't know. When Eleanor thanked her for coming, Okafor said she made a point of seeing the outcomes of the cases her division worked, because the cases were always about paperwork at the beginning and turned out to be about people by the end. Eleanor said, "This one was about a man who kept his word." Okafor said, "Those are the best kind." Lucas was there, standing near the shed with the ease of someone who belonged in a place, which he did. He had spent several Saturdays in February and March at the shed while the restoration work was happening, sometimes helping with things that required an extra set of hands, and sometimes just being present in the way teenagers are present at things they care about without quite admitting they care about them. He had developed what Eleanor recognized as a relationship with the place, a sense of its history and what it represented that she thought would stay with him. He was talking to Frank Osei's son, who was 17 and had helped with some of the construction work, and who was apparently interested in structural engineering in the way that people are interested in things that they have seen up close and found compelling. They were talking about the chestnut beams in the root cellar and why chestnut had been the preferred material for a certain generation of builders in this part of Virginia. Eleanor watched her son explain something technical and precise to someone who was listening with genuine attention and felt, for the first time in a long time, the uncomplicated pleasure of watching a person become themselves. Lily had been down the stairs of the root cellar 6 times in the previous 2 weeks, going alone each time with the flashlight and coming back with a specific kind of satisfied expression, the expression of someone who has a private relationship with a place and is not yet ready to share it with the general public. Eleanor had let her go without comment. She understood the impulse. Today Lily was standing near the door with her best friend from school, a girl named Rosie who had been hearing about the shed for months and had reached the limit of her capacity to hear about it without seeing it. They were waiting, with the specific impatience of 9-year-olds, for their turn to go down the stairs. Eleanor stood near the entrance and watched people come out of the root cellar and stood in the April morning with the green hills behind her and the smell of new grass and the sound of 40 people discovering a story they had not known was here. She noticed the moment when the group's energy shifted. It happened about an hour into the morning, after most people had been down and come up and were standing in clusters talking about what they had seen. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, the transition from curiosity to something more settled, the particular quality of attention that a place develops when the people who have visited it have understood what it is. Calder County, she thought, now had a story about itself that it had not had before. Not the story that the county auctioneer had been telling, about a quarter-acre parcel with a storage building in deteriorated condition that the county wanted off its books. A different story, about a man who had kept faith for 30 years and a woman who had recognized that the things most people couldn't see were the things most worth looking at. She was part of that story. She had not sought to be, but she was in it. And she was going to be in it in the versions that people told to each other and to their children. And she was going to try to be in it the way she wanted to be, not as the widow who got lucky, but as the person who went back to the shed a second time with a flashlight and a pry bar and made herself go down the stairs. The weeks between the Heritage Center's planning and its opening had been full of the particular kind of work that doesn't look like work from the outside, but is, in fact, the hardest kind. The decisions that required her to sit with discomfort before arriving at clarity. The question of what to say publicly and what to keep private. The question of how to acknowledge Harlan MacAllister without constructing a mythology around him that erased the ordinary human details of who he had actually been. She had driven to the county library and found very little on the MacAllister family, which was itself a form of information. A man who had run a modest orchard operation for 40 years had left almost no documentary footprint outside the land records and the photographs that had ended up in a box at the Historical Society. He had not been a civic figure. He had grown apples and kept his word and died alone without heirs in 1988, and the county had taken the land. She had found one newspaper item from the Calder County Gazette in October 1971, noting that H. J. MacAllister of Route 9 had received a commendation from the Virginia Agricultural Extension Service for 40 consecutive years of record-keeping. There was a photograph. Harlan MacAllister at 60, standing in his orchard with the posture of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, squinting slightly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was not unwilling. She had looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked like someone who would keep his word. She was aware that this was backward, that she was reading character into a face after already knowing the character it contained. But she looked at him anyway, at the squint and the posture and the hands that were visible at his sides with the specific texture of hands that had spent 40 years in soil and bark and apple crates. She had the photograph reproduced for the display. In February, while Frank Osei's crew was working on the shed restoration, a letter arrived at 4 Birchwood Lane from Bogota, Colombia. It was forwarded from Whitaker's office, having been sent there first because the name Marsh had appeared in a regional news article about the MacAllister discovery that had been picked up by a Spanish-language wire service. The letter was written in Spanish, which Eleanor could not read, and Whitaker arranged for a translation. The letter was from a man named Carlos Reyes, who described himself as the grandson of Augusto Reyes. He had seen the article and had searched for the family mentioned. He wrote that his grandfather had died in 1979 and that the family had known there were assets held somewhere in the United States, placed there for safekeeping during a period of political uncertainty, but had never been able to identify where, and that after 2 generations of not knowing, they had assumed the assets were permanently lost. He wrote that he was not writing to make a claim. He had consulted an attorney in Bogota who had confirmed that the legal standing for such a claim did not exist after this length of time and this sequence of transfers. He wrote that he was writing because he wanted to say that his family was glad the gold had gone to someone who had found it honestly and was using it with what appeared to be care and intention. He wrote that his grandfather had trusted Harlan MacAllister because Harlan MacAllister had been the kind of man you could trust, and that the story of what had been found and what was being done with it suggested that the trust had found its way, through a long route, to the right place. He signed it with his full name and a brief wish for her children's well-being. Eleanor read the translation 3 times. Then she wrote back, in English, asking Whitaker to arrange translation into Spanish. She thanked Carlos Reyes for writing. She told him about the Heritage Center and the compass and the display. She told him that his grandfather's name would be part of the story the display told, that the arrangement between Augusto Reyes and Harlan MacAllister was documented in the ledger that was now preserved under archival conditions in the Heritage Center's collection. She said she was sorry the family had spent 2 generations not knowing, and that she hoped the knowing, even now, was better than the not knowing. She asked if he had any photographs of Augusto Reyes that he would be willing to share for the collection. He wrote back within a week. He sent 4 photographs, scanned from originals, of a man she could now put a face to in the story. Augusto Reyes in Bogotá in the 1940s. Augusto Reyes with his family, his wife, and 2 children, in front of a house with a garden. Augusto Reyes in what appeared to be a professional setting, behind a desk. And 1 photograph, undated, that showed Augusto Reyes with another man, standing outside a building she did not recognize, both men looking at the camera with the particular formality of an era that took photographs seriously. The other man had the posture of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and had stopped noticing it. He was squinting slightly at the camera. She looked at the photograph for a long time. 2 men who had made an arrangement in 1951 and kept it, one through trust and one through faithfulness, across decades and a death and a transfer and 60 years of locked boxes in a root cellar under an apple orchard. She had the photograph added to the display. The Heritage Center now had 4 photographs on its walls. Harlan MacAllister in his orchard in 1971. Augusto Reyes in Bogotá in the 1940s. The 2 men together, undated, squinting at a camera that neither of them would have known was preserving the evidence of their arrangement. And the MacAllister orchard at the height of its operation, apple trees in rows that stretched toward the Virginia hills, a working place in a working landscape, unremarkable from the road and entire in itself. The children who came on school field trips, which began in the fall after the Heritage Center had been open for 6 months, stood in front of the photographs and asked questions that their teachers had not prepared answers for. They asked why the gold had been in Colombia in the first place. They asked why Harlan MacAllister hadn't just taken it. They asked why someone would keep a secret for 30 years. They asked, with the directness that children bring to moral questions, whether it was wrong to have kept something that belonged to someone else without telling anyone. Eleanor came to answer questions on the field trip days. She had not planned to do this and then found herself doing it, because the questions children asked were better than the questions adults asked and deserved better answers than the interpretive text could provide. She told them that Harlan MacAllister had done what he said he would do, and that was all. She told them that was actually very hard. She told them that people made promises in easy circumstances and kept them in hard ones, or didn't, and that what you found out about a person was not who they were when keeping their word was easy, but who they were when it cost them something. She told them that Harlan MacAllister had been offered, by simple circumstance, an exit from whatever difficulties his life contained, and he had declined it because the price was being a different person than the person he had decided to be. The children thought about this. Several of them, on separate field trip days, had asked a version of the same follow-up question. They asked, but did he know somebody would find it? Eleanor had thought about this for a long time before arriving at her answer. She told them that she thought Harlan MacAllister had known someone might find it, and had written the ledger and the notarized letter and filed the letter in a courthouse folder specifically because he wanted someone to understand, when they found it, that it had been kept in good faith, but that she thought he had also been prepared for no one to ever find it, that he had made peace with the possibility that the root cellar would stay sealed and the boxes would stay locked and the story would stay untold. She told them that the ability to do the right thing without being certain anyone would ever know you had done it was its own form of courage, different from the kind you got credit for, but not less important. The children who were old enough to understand this understood it. The ones who weren't would understand it eventually, in whatever circumstances eventually required it of them. On the afternoon of the Heritage Center's opening, after the crowd had come and gone and Lily had finally taken Rosie down the stairs and come back out, chattering about the compass, Eleanor stayed behind. She sent the children home with Miriam, who had offered and who the children liked well enough. She waited until the last person had driven away down the gravel of Route 9. Then she walked into the shed alone. The restoration had preserved everything she had wanted preserved. The floor with its wide chestnut boards. The seam and the iron ring, still flush with the wood, still invisible unless you knew to look. The smell of apples and thyme, diminished but present, the ghost of what the place had been, a working storage for a man whose life had revolved around the production and care of a living crop. She opened the hatch. She went down the stone stairs. She stood in the root cellar with the display case lit and Harlan MacAllister's compass behind its glass and the replica boxes stacked against the back wall in their original configuration. She stood there for a while. She thought about an October morning and $12. She thought about Gerald Potts's gavel in the cold air. She thought about standing in this room the first time with Lucas and the flashlight going amber and 18 locked boxes and a ledger that told 30 years of one man's faithfulness. She thought about Daniel at 3 in the morning feeding the furnace while a lawsuit consumed their savings. She thought about Lily in the frost-hardened grass talking to a sparrow that had no reason to be there and every reason to be there. She put her hand on the stone wall. The stone was cool and steady, the same temperature it had been in October, the same temperature it had been for 60 years before that, the constant that existed below the frost line and below the seasonal swings and below the noise of whatever was happening above it. The stone didn't know about foreclosure proceedings or gold valuations or county auctions. It had been here before all of that and would be here after all of it. It simply was and was reliable and held its temperature, and this was enough. She stood there until the light from above told her the afternoon was moving toward evening. Then she climbed the stairs and closed the hatch and walked out of the shed into the April light. Her car was the only one left at the gravel turnout. Down Route 9 in one direction was Calder County, the hardware store and the farm supply and the real estate office and the veterinary clinic and the courthouse with its records room and the auction house parking lot where she had raised her hand on a cold October morning for $12. Down Route 9 in the other direction was the house at 4, Birchwood Lane, with its renovated rooms and its new furnace and its bedroom where Lily slept in warmth she had been promised and would have from now on, with its kitchen table and its morning light and the ceiling Daniel had painted twice and the curtains he had hung slightly crooked and never gotten around to fixing. She stood at the gravel turnout for a moment, between the two directions. Then she thought about Lucas waiting at home with whatever college websites had been open on his computer. She thought about Lily describing the compass to Rosie in the specific and authoritative way of someone who has a personal relationship with a historical artifact. She thought about the notebook on the kitchen table with its list of careful decisions. She got in the car. She thought, driving home through the April hills, about what the next years looked like. Not in the grand terms of wealth and possibility, which were real but abstract. In the immediate terms of mornings and dinners and school pickups and homework and all the accumulated ordinary material of which a life was actually made. The life she was going to make was not going to be unrecognizable from the one she had been living. The house was the same house. The town was the same town. The children were the same children. The difference was underneath, structural, the difference between a floor built over earth that would freeze and heave and crack and a floor built over a root cellar whose temperature never varied. The ground was stable now. Everything built on it could be built to last. She thought about James Whitaker, who was 62 years old and had spent 40 years doing careful work for people who couldn't afford flashier options and who had described her case as genuinely interesting. She had sent him a letter thanking him for the 15% when more was standard and for the phone call to the mortgage servicer. He had written back, briefly saying the case had been the most satisfying of his career and that he hoped she would not have occasion to need his services again, which he meant as a wish for her stability rather than a reduction in his business. She pulled into the driveway of 4, Birchwood Lane as the sun went low over the tree line. The house looked like the house. The same aluminum gutters and the maple in the front yard that Daniel had planted from a sapling the spring they moved in, spending a Saturday afternoon arguing with himself about how deep to dig the hole, and ultimately planting it at the depth his instinct said rather than the depth the instructions said, and it had thrived. She went in. Lucas was at the kitchen table with his laptop, which was covered in what appeared to be engineering department websites. He looked up when she came in and said, "How did it go?" She said, "Well." She said it had been a good day. He said, "Did Potts come?" She said he had. Lucas said, "And?" She said, "And it was fine. It was a fine day." He looked at her for a moment in the way he had been looking at her since October, measuring her with the calibrated attention of a person who had learned to read the difference between fine as deflection and fine as truth. He appeared to decide it was truth. He said, "There's food." He had made pasta. The same pasta she made when she needed the mechanical comfort of a familiar process, which told her that he had understood something about this day that she had not told him. She sat down at the kitchen table. Lily came from the direction of her room with a book and a hair tie she needed help with. Eleanor fixed the hair tie and looked at the pasta cooling on the stove and looked at her children in the kitchen of the house that was theirs. She thought about the notebook with its careful list. She thought about Patricia Holt's stewardship plan with its trusts and its funds and its structures for preserving what had been found. She thought about the compass behind its glass in the root cellar and Harlan MacAllister writing in his ledger on his 70th birthday about what it meant to keep your word. She thought about what it meant to keep faith. Not the kind that required another party, the kind that Harlan had kept with a man long dead. The kind you kept with yourself, with the version of yourself you had committed to being when nobody was watching. She had gone back to the shed the second time. That was the thing. She could have let it be $12 of nothing and stayed afraid, and nobody would have blamed her. And the root cellar would still be there under the crumbling floor, being nobody's root cellar, holding nobody's fortune, waiting for someone else to look at a seam in the planks and wonder what made it. But she had gone back. With the flashlight and the pry bar and her son, she had made herself go down the stairs. And everything that had followed was the consequence of that return, of that second visit, of the refusal to let the first look be the last look. This was what she wanted her children to know. Not the number, though they knew the number and would carry it through their lives with the weight and the responsibility it deserved. Not the legal process or the federal review or the careful stewardship plan. The thing she wanted them to know was simpler than any of those things and harder to teach. She wanted them to know that going back mattered. That looking again mattered. That the seam in the floor only became a door when you got down on one knee and traced it with your fingers and refused to let the available light be the only light. She looked at her children at the kitchen table. Lucas with his engineering websites and his father's jacket over the back of his chair where he had put it when he came inside. Lily with her book and her hair tie and her particular certainty that the world contained more worth investigating than most people bothered to investigate. She said, "I want to tell you something." They both looked at her. She said, "When I bought the shed, I didn't know what was in it." She said, "I had a theory, and the theory turned out to be right, but I didn't know." She said, "There was a morning when the bank letter was on the counter, and you were both at school, and I was in this kitchen trying to figure out what to do, and the auction was in 2 days, and every rational thing I understood about our situation said that $12 was $12 we didn't have to spare." She paused. She said, "I went anyway. Because the seam in the floor was real, and I had seen it, and I was not going to let what I had seen be replaced by what I was afraid of." She said, "That's the thing I want you to remember from all of this. Not the gold, and not the number, and not any of the rest of it. Just that." She said, "When you see something real, don't let the fear be louder." Lucas looked at her for a long moment with his father's eyes. Then he said, "Okay." Lily said, "Like the sparrow." Eleanor looked at her daughter. Lily said, "The sparrow that came and sat near me. That was real. And I didn't move, even though I was a little scared, and it stayed." Eleanor said, "Exactly like the sparrow." They ate their pasta. Outside, the April evening settled over Calder County, over the Route 9 corridor, over the MacAllister Heritage Center with its restored shed, and its open root cellar, and its compass behind glass, and its 30-year story about the kind of person who keeps their word when keeping it costs them nothing except everything else they could have had. The maple in the front yard was coming into leaf. Daniel had planted it too deep by the instructions, and it had thrived. The curtains hung slightly crooked in the kitchen window, and the ceiling was painted the second color because the first hadn't been quite right. The toolbox was in the garage. The jacket was on the back of Lucas's chair. The house held what it held. The root cellar was open to visitors. The ground under everything was stable. Eleanor Marsh had gone back to the shed. Everything else was what happened next. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.